এগুলো তো তোমার ভালো যদি হয় ইনকেস সেটা করবে।
I can't hear you.
আসসালামু আলাইকুম মুশতাক স্যার।
আচ্ছা, ওয়ালাইকুম আসসালাম। এখন শুনতে পাচ্ছি। আপনি শুনতে পাচ্ছেন আমাকে?
জি স্যার, আপনাকে শুনতে পাচ্ছি। স্যার, আপনার কোনো প্রেজেন্টেশন যদি থাকে তাহলে
হ্যাঁ,
স্যার প্লিজ স্ক্রিন
আছে,
শেয়ার।
প্রেজেন্টেশন আছে। So I'll share it.
কি মানে রেস্ট করতে হবে?
Can you see my screen?
ইয়েস স্যার, দেখা যাচ্ছে।
আচ্ছা, আচ্ছা, স্ক্রিনের উপরে যে একটা সবুজ রঙের বার, ওটাও কি দেখা যাচ্ছে নাকি? না, ওটা দেখা যাচ্ছে না?
না স্যার, দেখা যাচ্ছে না স্যার।
ও গুড, ওকে। বিকজ জুমের আমার সবসময় মনে হয় উপরে একটা বার থাকে, ওটা কি ডিস্টার্ব করে নাকি কাউকে? না, ইটস ওকে, ফাইন।
Assalamualaikum,
হ্যালো,
Mushtaq Khan.
ওয়ালাইকুম আসসালাম, নাইস টু সি ইউ।
Nice to see you too.
Test Q&A.
Sure, we have 5 minutes now. Let's wait. কতজন রেজিস্টার করেছে? লেটেস্ট ফিগারস আমরা জানি
91.
91।
আচ্ছা, তো আমার যদি একটু একটু সময় বেশি লাগে, কোনো অসুবিধা নাই তো মেনাজ?
না না, এটা তো আমাদের মধ্যেই কোনো সমস্যা নাই।
আচ্ছা,
It's an
কতক্ষণ
online
আপনাদের বুকিং কতক্ষণের?
আমরা 2 ঘন্টা ব্লক করে রেখেছি,
Oh,
ইনক্লুডিং
okay.
কোয়েশ্চেন আনসার।
Fine. So fine, I can go up to 1 hour then.
জি। সো ফরম্যাট ইজ, প্রথমে ইমরান ভাই একটা ইন্ট্রোডাকশন দিবে ব্রিফলি, তারপরে দ্য ফ্লোর উইল বি ইয়ার্স, লাস্টে হয়তো ইমরান ভাই একটু ক্লোজ থ্যাঙ্কস দিয়ে দিবে।
আচ্ছা, ইমরান ভাই
Simple.
আছেন? I see.
হ্যাঁ 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 হ্যাঁ, he'll be joining this year.
Isn't he in London? I thought he was in London. No,
He's here.
that's good. আপনাকে আমি দেখিনি আগে। আপনি, because I got a mail from someone called Wadud. I presume you are not Wadud.
Yes, I'm not Wadud. This is Wadud ভাই, I don't know if
দেখা যাচ্ছে না
আপনাকে
আমাকে।
দেখা যাচ্ছে না।
হ্যালো স্যার।
Wadud ভাই একটু সামনে আগে আসেন।
ও আচ্ছা, এটা Wadud, right?
Good to see
Hi
you.
Wadud.
Hi.
Good. Okay.
স্যার আমি ফিরোজা, আমি কমিউনিকেশন অ্যাসোসিয়েট হিসেবে আছি বিএড।
Right. Okay.
Pitmenas, you'll let us know when to start, right?
Yes, Firoza, Wadud, participants এখানে দেখাচ্ছে 9 জন, বাট আরো তো অনেক হওয়ার কথা, একটু ওয়েট করে 2 মিনিট।
ওকে আপু, আমরা তাহলে কিছুক্ষণ ওয়েট করি।
So, Imran, are we meeting on the 16th in London?
16? আমি তো এইখানে 16 কি হচ্ছে?
16th, you have a meeting with our director. It's
Oh
on the
no,
calendar.
I know. I'm not. আমি আসতেছি না. Our acting VC and the registrar, they will be there. আমি আসতেছি না.
Okay, so please let me know where to meet them and so on. So
Okay, ঠিক আছে. I will ask. Yeah, I will organize that.
okay, I thought you were coming. Okay, right. Okay.
Okay, Imran bhai, I think we can start.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone. And I hope we're going to have more people joining soon. So let me introduce myself. My name is Imran Mateen. I am the Executive Director of the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. We are a research and a postgraduate teaching institute of BRAC University. We have launched a series of lectures and invited a number of prominent thinkers and researchers working on this broad theme of making policy work for development. And we are starting these series today. The first lecture is going to be given by Professor Mushtaq Khan. He's a professor of economics at SOAS University of London. He has made a notable contribution in the field of institutional economics, particularly focusing on developing countries. There's a particular concept and a framework called political settlement that he has developed, which has been widely used in terms of understanding why certain types of policies or interventions actually work or can have some promise of working or not working. So in terms of effective policy implementation, effective governance, industrial policy, anti-corruption policy, these are the areas in which this particular framework Professor Khan has used very extensively. He has served various governing bodies such as the United Nations, the World Bank as an expert advisor. We have had long collaboration with Mushtaq Bhai, so it's a great pleasure and honor to have him give our first lecture. We're doing all of this in the context of celebrating the 10 years of BIGD. So it sort of gives us a kind of a special way to sort of kick that celebration off as well. So thank you very much, Mushtaq Bhai, but over to you, Mushtaq Bhai. Just to give you a sense of how we're going to be organizing this. So Mushtaq Bhai will give his lecture for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then we're going to have a question and answer, will be moderated by my colleague Mehnaz Rabbani, and then I'll come towards the end to give some closing reflections. So that's how it's going to be organized. For the Q&A, given this is an online event, so we're going to be relying on the chat box. So please give your comments either in Q&A or in chat box, and Mehnaz will basically use that and try and distill them and organize them in some ways to ask questions for to Mushtaq Bhai. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Professor Mushtaq Khan. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. A great pleasure to be speaking to you today. So I'm going to kick off with this lecture on making policy work for development and raise a number of issues which we are addressing with our political settlements framework, which I think is relevant for making sense of how to design policy in developing countries. So let me begin by distinguishing some different types of questions that one can ask about policy. The first question about policy is obviously its theoretical reasonableness of the policy instrument that we are talking about. Now, most of the discussion about policy focuses on this. So what is policy trying to do? Policy is a set of rules. So rules about who is taxed and who is subsidized, rules about regulation. And these rules are what policy means. And policy is supposed to change the incentives of actors. So actors could be individuals or organizations, so that their behavior changes in socially appropriate ways to achieve some social objectives, which could be efficiency, which could be distributive, which could be whatever, right? So policy is trying to change rules or designing rules to change behavior. That's the starting point of the discussion. I'm not going to be spending a lot of time on that because that's an important area, but that's the kind of thing that textbooks on economics or development focus on. What I'm going to look at is something else, but I'll come to that in a while. So, but keep this in mind that we start with some ideas about rules. The next problem is that these rules may or may not be adopted or translated into legislation. So you can think of lots of interesting rules, but these might not be rules that your government or your country is going to legislate because it might not be picked up. So there is a whole literature on the political economy of policy adoption. And the idea there is that policies are adopted because policymakers have certain interests or they have certain constituencies, and those constituencies have interests. And so the policy that is adopted has to fit in with those interests. And this goes back to Marxist class analysis or public choice theory and collective action theory of different types, which looks at the political economy of policy adoption. And that's a really important part of the conversation about, we can think of all kinds of policies, but they might be totally unrealistic given the interests of policymakers. I'm not even going to be talking about that, because, although that's an important area if you're talking about policy. I'm going to focus on a third element of this problem, which is those policies that even after they're adopted, even if they're good in theory, can they be implemented in practice? And this raises a completely different set of political economy questions, which are often confused with B. So people often confuse the adoption problem with the implementation problem. And that is a serious shortcoming of a lot of political economy approaches to policy implementation. So the implementation problem is completely different, I think. And that asks the question that you might try to change the rules. Those rules might be legislated and adopted, but does it actually change behavior? Does it actually mean that the organizations whose behavior you're trying to change will actually change their behavior? And this raises a whole new set of questions about the interest, the power, and capabilities, not of policymakers in adopting things, but of the individuals and organizations who are supposed to respond to these incentives. What are they going to do in response to those changes? And that's a completely different set of questions. Now, if you're talking about what's a feasible set of policy for a country, you're actually looking at the intersection of all these things. So we are looking for that intersection of policy which is theoretically plausible, will be adopted, and will be implemented. And that limits your policy, which is effective, to a very small subset. And sometimes, for many important areas of policy, that intersection X might be an empty set. In other words, we might have to do a lot of things to create that intersection. And that's one of the really important areas of discussion. So a lot depends on finding that sweet spot where your policy will actually change behavior and be adopted, and it makes sense. Okay. So let's go back to how the history of thought in terms of how this implementation issue came to the fore. And it comes to the fore really in a big way in Gunnar Myrdal's famous book or set of books on the Asian drama, which was written in 1968 and raises a question that continues to dominate a lot of institutional economics debates. And that question that Gunnar Myrdal posed as a kind of drama is that policy implementation wasn't happening in a lot of developing countries, and his focus, as you probably know, was on India. And he did a lot of economic anthropology on India. And he pointed out that, there were a lot of policies, but actually they were not implemented. And a lot of the terminology and thinking has become really central from that seminal work in subsequent thinking on institutional economics and the debates on institutional economics. So he raised a number of issues which have dominated subsequent thinking. This includes the idea of corruption, of the soft state, of informal institutions and culture. And from that, he came to some conclusions which I don't agree with, but they were defining conclusions about why developing countries were stuck. And he takes a radical revolutionary position, saying essentially that tinkering with the system won't work. You have to have a massive radical transformative change, because you have to break the interconnections between all these things, between corruption, the soft state, and culture, and so on, which was a kind of equilibrium, and you have to break this equilibrium. And that argument sets the tone for a lot of subsequent discussions in the emerging area of institutional economics, and what became known as new institutional economics, but also in political economy. And a lot of the terms that emerge in the subsequent debate really are informed by Myrdal's
We lost Mushtaq bhai. Minaz, can you hear me?
তোমার ভাই মেবি ওনার সাইড থেকে কোনো ইস্যু হচ্ছে।
Acha, so if you could let him know. Thanks. Just give us a sec.
আমি জানিয়েছি।
Yeah.
ইন্টারাপশন, আমরা মুসা স্যারের সাথে কন্ট্যাক্ট করে আপনাদেরকে আবার ইনফর্ম করছি। Professor Mushtaq will be joining in a bit. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I apologize for the interruption. Professor Mushtaq is facing some internal tech-related problem. Let us wait 2 to 3 minutes and he will be joining us. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Professor Mushtaq is among us at this moment, and he will be starting his presentation shortly.
I'm really sorry for this disruption, but somehow my internet dropped out. Where should I start again, Mehnaz? Because I don't know at what point we dropped out, or should I begin from the beginning? I don't know.
No, we saw the first point on this slide.
Okay. So let me continue with this slide then. And apologies again for the technical disruption. So the implementation issue began with Gunnar Myrdal's Asian drama, as I was saying earlier. This magisterial piece of work raised this question that in India, where he was doing his economic anthropological work, there was a severe problem of policy implementation. Policies looked good on paper, but when they came into the implementation phase, there was a lot of things that were going wrong. And he identified a number of issues that later became really important. The issue of corruption in the implementation of programs, the issue of the soft state. The state didn't have the capacity to implement things, it seemed. Informal institutions and culture, where people behaved in ways that were quite different from what the incentives were saying. So you can create incentives for behavior change, but people's behavior doesn't change because they're responding to cultural norms and things like that. And he made this argument for a radical big bang revolutionary change in the whole structure of these interconnections, arguing that small policy interventions won't really work in such a context. And so this was this context of the drama. And subsequent research in institutional economics picks this up and deepens and develops some of these arguments in the later analysis of rents and rent seeking, of government failures and market failures, and the huge literature on governance and of corruption and its role in policy implementation, and debates which are even going on today about whether you need a big bang shift in institutional structures or whether incremental reforms will work in contexts where implementation is a severe problem. So that was the starting point of that discussion. 50 years later, in a book edited by Deepak Nayyar, those issues are revisited, and a team of people, which includes, I have a chapter in that book, and I'm going to draw on this chapter. This team discussed, what is the state of knowledge? Because that Asian drama has now become a story of Asian transformations, even though these transformations are very uneven, and you have a whole variety of Asian stories from South Korea on the one hand, and then China, India, Bangladesh, Vietnam. You have a lot of variations in this transformation story. And what is the state of our current knowledge? This book, by the way, is open access. So if you search for it on the internet, you can read it for free. And I'm going to be drawing on my work in that book and other work that I have done. So what this kind of re-evaluation of where we are now tells us is a much more complicated story than the one that Gunnar Myrdal had begun with. And the complicated story is that some policies and reforms work in some countries, but the same policies and reforms in other countries have very different effects. And I'm going to use the example later on in my talk on the story of industrial policy in South Korea versus in the Indian subcontinent. In the case of South Korea, industrial policy had, or Taiwan, and later on in China, had a very transformative effect in hot housing economic development. But in other countries, the same policies of subsidizing industry, of giving them lower interest bank loans and so on, simply resulted in a lot of inefficient companies and the capture of resources by crony capitalists. So why were these differences happening? Similarly, we know that countries have used very different policies to successfully achieve very different goals. So some countries rely quite heavily on public sector companies. others on private sector companies. Some countries rely on education through private schools, some have education through public schools. So different kinds of policies, different kinds of institutional structures work. And so there's a lot of variation across the successful cases, and similar policies result in success in some cases and failure in other cases. So it's quite confusing. And that raises a very important question of how do you design policies in these different contexts to be effective in that specific context. And this conversation remains a challenge, and a lot of the research that is happening in policy is trying to answer the last question. So at its heart, the challenge is to identify the factors that explain variations in results, both within countries and across countries. So what is it that makes some policies work and other policies not work, and so on? Is it the leadership of the country or of the agency? Is it the interests of the ruling coalition? Are these questions of culture? Are they questions of other supporting institutions or rules in the same country? What is it? And this is actually quite a difficult question to answer. It's much more complicated than it sounds, because the data is very complex, and it suffers from what statisticians call an endogeneity problem, where everything affects everything else. And so you don't know what is causing what. And this results in, a lot of different methods have to be used. Some of them are inductive methods, where you look at patterns across countries and try to figure out what explains these patterns, but also deductive methods, where you have a hypothesis and then you test the hypothesis with data. And actually good work has to use both, because before you test a hypothesis, you must have a hunch about why you are testing that hypothesis and why it makes sense. And so this iterative use of inductive and deductive methods results in many controversies, and people will present conflicting sets of data to argue quite different stories, and which is what makes this whole field very interesting, but also one that, if you are looking for quick answers and short, things to read, you will make a mistake. You really need to read a lot and have an idea of the different approaches people are using, and then reach your own conclusions. It's a very complex area. So in that whole debate is the political settlements approach that I have developed. And that argues that if you're trying to understand this implementation, which is really a question of, are individuals adhering to rules, and are those rules being enforced, you have to look at the interaction between institutions and organizations. This is the specific contribution of the political settlements approach. Institutions are the rules. So what economists mean when they say institutions are the rules. So normally people think of, for example, a university as an institution, but a university is not an institution. Within the university, there are rules. There are all kinds of rules about how the university conducts itself, and there are rules that are set from outside the university about how universities have to conduct themselves. And that mix of rules, both internal and external, are the institutions that govern the university. But the university is an organization. The university is a collection of people who are following those rules or not following those rules. So the rules might be saying, this is how you should appoint academics, but the university may decide not to follow those rules and violate those rules. So there is a distinction between the rules, which are the institutions, and the organizations that are the groups of people who are following or not following those rules. And the political settlements argument says you have to look at both. You have to look at both how the institutions have been set up, but also the interests and the power of the organizations, the subgroups or groups that are following those rules, to understand how or why you are being able to implement or not implement certain rules, which is kind of obvious to me, but it's actually quite a novel way of thinking about the problem. And that means that if you are looking at the policy implementation problem, a critical variable is that you have to look at the historically inherited power and capabilities of your organizations. You can't read that off from the theory. Outside the theory, you must have an idea of how power and capabilities are developing in your society, how organizations are changing, and you have to think of the policy making in that context. Now, this is, again, also quite innovative in the sense that many economists have analytical models that are not reliant on having a historical understanding of where a country is at a particular place. The political settlements analysis says you can't do that because you can't read off the distribution of power and capabilities of your organizations from pre-existing institutions. You have to read that off from a reading of history. Now, this will become clearer as we go through the lecture. So one way of making sense of this interdependence of institutions and organizations is to present a very simple map and ask ourselves the question, why do some countries, particularly more advanced countries, have a better enforcement of formal rules? And by that, is often understood this concept of a rule of law, which I'm going to come back to. So in advanced countries, what you find is that when you set the rules, even those people who disagree with those rules actually follow those rules and try to change the rules. And so their disagreement with the rules is about changing the rules. Whereas in other countries, if the rules are not aligned with my interests, I simply violate the rules. So this question of, if I dislike the rules, do I try to change the rules or do I simply violate the rules, is actually extremely important in terms of designing the policy. Because there's no point in designing a policy if a lot of your organizations are simply going to evade the policy or violate it and get away with it. So the starting point is to ask, what makes a society rule following? And the political settlements answer is, this is not a cultural issue, it's an issue of power and interests. And the way it works is this, that you begin, if your society has a number of organizations, and these organizations are highly capable organizations which need rule following for their own internal operation and to interact with each other. So think of complex capitalist firms. A capitalist firm in a complex world is interacting with lots of other firms, can't operate without rule enforcement because they're doing hundreds and thousands of contracts with each other, with financial organizations, with their own workers. If that's your structure of power and capabilities, if those are your organizations, those organizations will drive the creation of rules, which are formal rules like property rights or rules of taxation, rules of subsidy. And those rules will be set up in a way that these organizations benefit from those rules. So the rules then create a distribution of benefits that is aligned with the interests of those organizations. So they maintain their profitability, they maintain their growth and dynamism. And because the distribution of benefits is aligned with the interests of these organizations, the organization's power is reproduced. So the organizations get reproduced through the institutions, and therefore the organizations will support the general enforcement of the rules, even if an individual organization might want to violate the rules, like not pay taxes or not follow health and safety regulations. Once they're detected, they themselves and all other organizations will ensure that that organization starts following the rules. In other words, the reason why they follow rules is because there's a lot of pressure from everybody else in that society that they should follow the rules. So when you see a society where everyone is following the rules, it's not just, you can't understand it without looking at this interdependence between organizations, institutions, and the benefits, the distribution of rents, as we call it in economics, but also the distribution of benefits in a commonsensical way of those rules. And this equilibrium creates a rule-following society. But what happens if a lot of your organizations that are powerful don't want to follow rules? For example, they might be organizations that don't yet have the capabilities that make rule-following viable. So if a lot of your big companies are not yet that capable, they are making money by borrowing money from banks and not repaying it. Or they are making money by colluding with public officials to get overpriced contracts. Or they are making money by capturing land, which is public land, and then trying to build on it. In other words, if the business model requires a lot of violations and lots of people are doing the violations, then you will have a lot of powerful organizations using informal institutions, patronage structures, corruption, different kinds of informal rent seeking. And those informal institutions then, or informal institutions basically means rule violations. This is another way of thinking about it. A lot of violations of formal rules, but those are also rules. They're rules of doing business, except that they're rules which are operating outside the formal rules, that's now driving a lot of your benefit distribution to these powerful organizations, and that reproduces their power. So what happens in countries where the distribution of power and capabilities is somewhat different is that a lot of informality gets locked into the system. And that informality is supported by powerful organizations. And therefore, you can't wish it away. You can't just legislate it away by passing some new rules. Those informal institutions actually reflect a distribution of power and capabilities in your society. This is the fundamental insight of the political settlements approach, which says that when you see different forms of corruption and informality, it's not just individuals who are violating rules, it's actually supported by a lot of collective action of power and interests, which are deliberately creating these informalities because they benefit from that. And then the question is, how do you design policy in this context to achieve your social goals? So this results in a really fundamental difference in the way you think about policy in countries with a strong rule of law and in countries where the rule of law is much weaker because powerful organizations don't yet want a rule of law. Okay, and the difference is this, that normally when you think of an enforcement problem, how to enforce policy, economists normally think of it as a principal agent issue, right? So the principal is the actor that wants a rule to be enforced, and the agents are other actors. They want the rules to be enforced, but also benefit by violating the rules, right? And they can violate the rules if they can hide information that they're violating the rules. So asymmetric information then becomes a driver of rule violation, or if the principal faces a collective action problem. So think of, so the principal could be voters and the agents could be politicians. So voters elect politicians to deliver certain things to them, but the politicians may violate that contract, may violate their manifesto promises, may start stealing money, and they can do this in two ways. The first way they can do it is they hide information about what they're doing from the voters, so the voters don't really know what's going on. The second way they can do it is because the voters are many in number, they have a collective action problem of actually coordinating their activity to vote out the corrupt politicians, and the corrupt politicians might buy out some of the voters and create a lot of noise in the system. And so the collective action problem might also allow politicians to steal money. Principals can also be politicians, and they might try to get bureaucrats to do things for them which they need to get done to get reelected, but the bureaucrats might hide information from politicians. So there might be lots of nested principal agent problems which are preventing policy implementation. And sometimes the principal are voters, sometimes the principals might be politicians, sometimes the principal might be higher level bureaucrats trying to get lower level bureaucrats to do what they are trying to get done. And in each case, asymmetric information and collective action might disrupt the outcome. I can't cover all of this, but let me just focus on the asymmetric information problem, because the standard response is if you have agents hiding what they're doing, then if you improve transparency and accountability systems, that should reduce the problem. Because if the principal can see more clearly what the agent is doing, they can't hide it. And the principal has accountability systems, that is, they can fire the agents or they can vote out the agents, then the ability of the agent to not implement what the principal wants to implement declines. Now, so that's why a lot of effort has been spent in developing countries in improving transparency and accountability. But in practice, this also hasn't really been very effective. So all the investments we have made in improving transparency and accountability, we now know who is violating. We now have the systems to control who is violating, but the systems are not used. So the open, violations of rules continues. And this goes back to the Merdalian problem that, as Myrdal pointed out, it's usually often that the violations are happening completely transparently, right? And the kind of Myrdalian response is that the principles are unprincipled. So if the principal doesn't want to follow the rules, then what are you going to do? Then transparency and accountability doesn't really help. And that shifts our focus to culture, social norms, ethics, etc., which is what Murdal did in his initial work. But I'm going to argue that the problem might be somewhere else. The problem is not culture. The problem is, or not only culture. I mean, that might be part of the problem, because culture is simply an equilibrium. If your system is working in a certain way, you get used to that. You expect that behavior, and you can describe that as culture. But it's not really an independent variable. It's not what is causing the problem. It's simply reflecting the problem. And I think one the response to that, which goes beyond the kind of cultural explanation of why principles are unprincipled, is that you have to go beyond the individual and look at how behavior is affected by other people you're interacting with and their power and their capabilities. And we focus on this in the political settlements framework by looking at the effectiveness of the horizontal checks on both principles and agents. Before I come to that, let me give you a very commonsensical way of thinking about it and ask yourself, why do people stand in queues? A queue is a very simple system of rules. The rule is that you stand in line and you get service in order of your position in the line. That's the simplest kind of rule. Now, in developing countries and in many parts of the world, those rules are violated. People don't stand in queues, and they try to break into the queue from ahead or violate the rule in different ways. If this is a cultural problem, then in a particular country, no queue should work. But what you find in developing countries is that in some places, people are standing in queues, and in other places, people don't stand in queues. So if you are in Gulshan and you're trying to catch a bus, you stand in line and you get on the bus, and everyone is standing in line. But in some remote areas, you might not be standing in line. If you are in a private sector bank, you will be standing in line. If you're in a remote area in a public sector bank, the same person will not be standing in line. Now, so that is not a cultural issue. What is going on? And the answer is that actually 99% of the reason why people stand in line is that if you try to break the line and other people in the line have the same power and capabilities as you have, they will pull you back into the line and say, you have to come back into the line, there's a queue. But if there's a very big disparity of power and capabilities in the queue, and everyone knows that, then people will try to break the queue and get ahead. No one will pull them back. And because some people are breaking the queue, other powerful people will say, I will never get on the bus if I don't break the queue. Powerful people are breaking in. I'm also powerful, so I will also break the queue. And then you have a kind of anarchic attempt to get into the bus. In other words, even if you take a simple example like standing in a line, it's not a cultural issue. It's not even an enforcement issue. It's or certainly a vertical enforcement issue of a principal agent type. It's really a horizontal checks and balances issue. Now, if you bring that into your analysis, you get a very different picture of what is going on about the implementation problem. So principles and agents are not operating independently. They are all embedded in multiple horizontal relationships. The principles are in relationships with other actors. The agents are in relationships with other actors. So, for example, the agent might be a company, but they're interacting with many other companies. The principal might be a bureaucrat, but the bureaucrat is engaging or is under pressure from political parties, from other agencies, from the media and other departments, and so on. So what happens in terms of enforcement depends on the power, capability, and interests of all these actors. And we have a paper called Making Anti-Corruption Real, which is on the SOAS ACE website. I'll give you a link later on, where we spell this out. Now, what happens is that if the horizontal actors want rules to be followed, so think of our queue, right? If the horizontal actors want the rules to be followed, then as soon as you have a detection of a violation, then there is pressure on everybody to start enforcing the rule. So a rule enforcement begins in the way in which a principal agent model says, only if the principal and the agent are both under a lot of pressure to follow the rules. So what happens in an advanced country is, let's say you have a company which is detected as not paying its tax. Now, the principal, the tax official on top of the company, the principal, might actually not be very powerful. And the company might be really powerful. It might be a massive multinational. But the point is, as soon as it is detected, other multinationals, other companies that are interacting with that company start putting pressure that that company should be sanctioned, because if it gets away with it, their businesses are affected. And the principal, even if they don't want to take the trouble of sanctioning this agent, will come under pressure from those other horizontal actors, and the principal who refuses to take action will actually be removed, right? So why transparency accountability works is, in fact, a lot of complex power relationships come into the game, which affect that enforcement. Whereas if that is not the case, you have a completely different outcome. The principal might detect the violation, but the other actors who are interacting with that agent don't mind if the violation happens, because they are also violating. And in fact, a principal which tries to enforce that rule may be removed by other principals. The politician or the boss might remove that principal because they're trying to enforce on the agent. In other words, the behavior of the principal and the agent is not an individual choice. It's embedded in lots of other relationships, which is the political settlement. So outcomes in the same country, in the same, and sometimes in the same sector, can vary from enforcement or partial enforcement to entrenched corruption and entrenched violations. And to make sense of this, you have to really embed that analysis in an analysis of how those horizontal interactions are happening. And this is where the political settlements analysis comes in. So how does this affect the way in which we think about policy? The simplest map of policy is the one that is in the textbooks. The policy is trying to change the behavior of organizations by changing their incentives with taxes, subsidies, regulations, and the aim is to achieve a better outcome. Okay, so that's economics textbook 101. You have a problem, you have a market failure, public goods, externalities, policy comes along, tries to change the outcome. And Murdahl says, well, the expected outcome fails to materialize because instead of changing the behavior of organizations, they captured the policy, right? So you take the subsidy, but you don't change your behavior. You face the tax, but you refuse to pay the tax. Or you pay the tax, and then you covered the tax by not repaying your bank loan. In other words, you are doing lots of things which are diluting the effect of the incentive change, and the outcome is not improving. This is exactly the problem that Murdahl was talking about in 1968, when he said that the policy is fine, but the outcome is not happening. So these are the examples that I began with. That if you think of industrial policy, you have industrial development banks which are giving lower interest credit to firms which are building capabilities in new sectors. You have tariff protection, you have export subsidies. These are providing resources to organizations to change their behavior, to overcome different kinds of market failures, to finance new technologies, to enable learning by doing, to raise productivity. But what happens if these firms simply take all these benefits, consume it, build houses or transfer the money out to Dubai or Singapore, and they don't raise their productivity? That was Murdahl's question. And it was a really relevant question. So the second step is the growth of governance models and governance theories, which say, yeah, this is indeed a problem. So what we need is better enforcement of rules. So it's not just that you change the incentives with some policy. You actually have to enforce the rules on A, B, and C with some governance agencies. And that is a gov actor at the top of A, B, and C. In other words, you introduce a principle, and the principle is supposed to now solve these problems of coordination, free riding, and enforcement. And if the principle does their work properly, then you will get the outcome that the policy is supposed to achieve. And here you have a variation. So if you're a liberal economist, you want to have governance agencies that enforce good governance. And we know what that means. It's trying to enforce contracts, the rule of law, is engaging in anti-corruption, is trying to enforce property rights and enforce political stability through fair elections and getting non-performing politicians voted out, etc., etc. So we know what good governance is. It's this whole gamut of things from good elections, strong property rights, anti-corruption, rule of law. And that's what the governance agency is doing, because if you have that, then those incentive changes from the policy will result in the outcomes that you're supposed to be achieving. At the same time, you have the more developmental state theorists who disagree with the liberal story, but they look at a different set of governance capabilities. State capabilities of enforcing discipline on your capitalists, a state with a vision and a mission to drive change, and the state acting impartially. But actually, despite their apparent differences between developmental state theorists and good governance theorists, they have one thing in common, which is that both are looking at different types of vertical enforcement. And liberal theorists are drawing on the example of the US and the UK, and developmental state theorists are drawing on the example of South Korea and China, or the East Asian growth stories. But they all assume that you can impose this vertical enforcement by some effort on improving the capacity of your governance agencies, and that this improvements in governance capabilities will then make your policy effective. And this too has not been a very successful agenda. I mean, in a lot of developing countries, you have years and years of good governance reforms coming to nothing. And in other countries, you have imitations of developmental state models, which have actually resulted in quite big disasters. So authoritarian governments trying to act in the name of economic development have often resulted in massively unproductive crony capitalist companies, which have sooner or later come to a sad end. And yet these policies did work in some countries, but they don't work in other countries. So what is missing? And this is where I think the political settlements analysis comes in, and simply says that what's missing here is that how you do your governance actually also depends on the interactions between those actors, their power and capabilities, and how they might be aligned with or not aligned with what you are trying to achieve. So what this is saying is that the debate is not really between liberal good governance versus developmental state. That is actually missing the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is what is the actual distribution of power and capabilities between your critical actors, and then that will determine what is the governance and policy strategy that will work in your case, which is not going to look like either a pure good governance strategy or a pure developmental state strategy in most countries, but some hybrid. And that hybrid will have to be discovered by us in a country like Bangladesh or India or Pakistan or wherever, or Nigeria. These are countries we work in, which would have to ask this question: what kinds of policies can actually be implemented to achieve a social purpose given those power, capabilities, and interests? So here, policy design matters a lot, because the policy design determines which organizations get the benefits, and are those organizations powerful enough to capture those benefits without delivering the results, or will they be checked by other organizations to deliver the result that the policymaker wants? So policy design now becomes a critical part, as well as the governance design, and it's the interdependence between the two which makes the thing complex. And this explains why conventional industrial policies worked in South Korea and not in Pakistan. And so I'll give this example as a way of clarifying the complexity of what I'm talking about, and it will become, I hope, a little clearer. But the same industrial policies that failed in Pakistan and India in the 1960s, but worked in South Korea, is a puzzle that all of these governance stories are trying to uncover. And I have an answer to why there was this difference, but also an answer for why very different kinds of industrial policies resulted in successful transitions in garments, in pharmaceuticals, in Indian automobiles. And these are all case studies that I've written about and in different papers. I don't have time to go into all of that, but I'll give you a taste of what that analysis is all about. So the starting point, let's look at industrial policies in the 1960s in East Asia and in South Asia. So in the 1960s, the industrial policies that were adopted in South Korea and Pakistan were actually quite similar. In fact, Pakistan was the first adopter, and many South Korean policymakers came to Pakistan to learn about how to do industrial policy. And the common features of these were export subsidies to large conglomerates, low interest loans, import protection, allocations of land to these big businesses, high concentrations of businesses in a few holding companies. And the idea was you will have a hothouse of putting resources into companies which will invest in new technologies, raise their capabilities, and soon they will not need support because they will become internationally competitive and they will keep driving growth on their own. That policy basically provided what I describe as ex-ante rents. In other words, you provide the resource before you achieve success. You provide the resource before you achieve success, and the expectation is you change the behavior of these firms, they raise productivity, they increase exports, they become productive, and then you don't need to support them anymore, okay? Now, critical assumption behind this is that when you provide the resource to these companies, if they don't actually convert this into productivity, you can impose some costs on them and you can take those rents away. And not only can you not take those support away, you can impose some additional costs on them so that they behave and try their best to turn those resources into productivity. That's an implicit assumption, but this assumption was not made clearly by anyone at that time. So what happened was that in South Korea, this indeed happened. The resources were converted into productivity growth, and we know what happened in South Korea. In 2 decades, it became an OECD country. And what happened in Pakistan was that for about 5 to 10 years, there was hothouse growth in the 1960s. But this growth was a kind of fake growth. There was a lot of growth in output, but there wasn't a growth in productivity. So these companies that were increasing output, and if you look at the statistics of Pakistan in the 1960s, it was the highest growth economy in South Asia. Its growth rate was much higher than India. And the idea of a lot of people was that Pakistan was the miracle story of South Asia, and it would soon become like South Korea. And in fact, underlying this high growth in output was an abysmal story of productivity growth. And eventually, of course, the whole experiment collapsed. So why did the same policy have such a big difference in the behavioral response of big companies in these 2 countries? Some of the obvious explanations are not correct. South Korea did not have a good rule of law. South Korea had very high levels of corruption at that time. It had a very limited democracy, and all of this was like Pakistan. Nor was the Pakistan state not interested in productivity and not interested in the waste that was happening. If you look at the newspapers of the late 1960s, you will find that there was public discussion of how the so-called 22 families, the big corporates who had got these subsidies, had wasted this money, had not invested, had low productivity growth. And so it's not that people didn't know about it in Pakistan. Ayub Khan actually arrested all of these big capitalists and put them in prison, trying to get them to change their behavior. But none of that worked. Whereas in South Korea, the similar things happened, but they worked, right? So the puzzle is that why did the same policies with the same kind of leadership response work in one case and completely fail in the other case? And the answer is actually the political settlement. You have to look at the differences in the power and capabilities of firms, parties, bureaucrats in these 2 countries. And I traced that back, and this is where I said at the very beginning, history matters. The distribution of power and capabilities has a long historical root. And the history goes back to Japanese versus British colonialism. Japanese colonialism, and I don't have time to go into it in great detail, but there's a lot of stuff that I've written on it in different places, and others have too. It's quite well known. Japanese colonialism was very destructive of horizontal links between actors. It came in and it atomized society in a way that links between businesses and politicians and bureaucrats were destroyed, and the Japanese ruled very firmly from above in very authoritarian and almost, I hate to use the word, but is a version of fascism, right? It actually broke up society, atomized it, and ruled from above, which is why the historical memory of Japanese colonialism is so very emotional in East Asia. People still haven't forgotten or forgiven the Japanese. The British, on the other hand, had a completely different strategy of colonial rule. They ruled through domestic elites. They empowered domestic elites. They created lots of checks and balances and divide and rule between the domestic elites. But domestic elites were also powerful, right? So the landlords and the bureaucrats and emerging political parties like the Congress and the Muslim League, they were all operating within the British establishment, and they were creating lots of complex horizontal checks on each other, which is why the historical memory of British colonialism is not as violently antithetical as Japanese colonialism. You will still find some older people who will have heard from their parents that the British weren't that bad, and the rule was actually quite efficient and so on. You will never hear that in South Korea or China about Japanese rule. Paradoxically, the relatively more benign British rule empowered a lot of unproductive organizations to check each other, and that, in my analysis, created the kind of distribution of power and capabilities, which makes a lot of policy implementation difficult. So whereas in South Korea, those horizontal relationships between actors meant that businesses could not form coalitions to protect their rent. So once you got a subsidy, if you didn't deliver to the planning commission or to the president, they could remove your subsidy and take it away, and you could not find any horizontal coalition to protect your subsidy. This is radically different, was and still is radically different. Not only could the South Korean state, by the way, remove the subsidy, they could remove the entire plant from one owner and give it to another owner. Can you imagine this ever happening in South Asia, where a business house is not able to run this plant, and the state just gives that entire plant to another business house? Now you run it, and you run it better. This was what the South Korean state could do. And I think you can't understand that simply by looking at policy. You have to understand that by looking at the relative power of these different actors and the horizontal networks they have with each other. Pakistan or India and now Bangladesh did not and does not have such a political settlement. Firms, politicians, and bureaucrats can form coalitions to protect their rents, regardless of whether they are productive or unproductive. And as a result, there is a fundamental difference in the type of informality and corruption in these two kinds of political settlements. In the South Korean case, the corruption was profit sharing. It means that the state was supporting firms. If the firms did not deliver the productivity growth, it would lose the subsidy and lose the plant to another owner. But once the firm was making a profit, the state would claim a share of the profits in terms of kickbacks. So this is what I call profit sharing corruption. Whereas in cases where the state is unable to break down these coalitions, the corruption becomes a subsidy sharing corruption. You are a firm, you are getting a subsidy, you are not raising your productivity because you can protect yourself by making coalitions with other firms and other bureaucrats and other political actors. And collectively, you protect your rent. The rent cannot be taken away. The rent cannot be transferred to somebody else. But then you also share some of that. So what you have is a subsidy sharing strategy, which can drive short-term growth. You can have a lot of firms that emerge and they appear to be exporting and they appear to be, but they don't achieve competitiveness. And actually, in the long run, they are not sustainable. And this kind of corruption, this kind of informality is what Madal was picking up in India. This kind of corruption protects inefficiency. So the issue is that you have to go a little bit deeper into understanding what kinds of informality are actually consistent with dynamic development and what types are not consistent with dynamic development. So if that is the case, how do you explain the transformation that happened in the Indian subcontinent from the 1980s onwards? Bangladesh's garments industry, India's pharmaceutical industry, to a lesser extent, Bangladesh's pharmaceutical industry, the auto industry in India. These are all really interesting stories. And those stories show that you can design industrial policy, but in a way that the incentives are now given in ways that the powerful actors can't capture it because other powerful actors are checking them. And this is, I think, the space in which my own research is working. But first, it requires a rereading of these stories, because if you read most of the stories of Bangladesh's garment industry takeoff, it looks like it happened because of low wages and open markets. You know, it was a liberalization story. Actually, yes, there are low wages and there is a export-oriented growth story, but there is something else which happened here, which developed the capabilities in the first place, and those capabilities developed through policy interventions, but of a completely different type from the ex-ante subsidy story of the 1960s. And the policy story here was, to some extent, a windfall. It was an accident for Bangladesh. The MFA created the potential for extra profits if an LDC firm, which was not quota bound, could achieve a certain level of productivity, it could access the US market and sell at a slightly higher price, because the efficient countries like South Korea and Turkey and so on had been excluded by quotas. This created an opportunity for an LDC to achieve some minimum level of productivity, and then it could start exporting and making money, but it had to achieve that minimum level of productivity. Achieving that minimum level of productivity was not easy. There was a market failure here, which is that getting that productivity achieved required a lot of investment in capability development, in organizational capabilities, in learning how to set up the business, in learning how to set up quality control, marketing, and those networks. And this is not something you can learn in a textbook. You have to invest a lot of resources in acquiring that. And that is what industrial policy is about. Industrial policy is about overcoming these market failures that constrain productivity growth. But here, that market failure was overcome in a completely different way. So what happened here was an agreement between, and again, many of you know the story, but probably not the interpretation that I'm going to give to that story. So the story is that in the late 1970s, Desh and Daewoo made an agreement to take some mid-level managers from Desh, take them to Daewoo's Busan facility, and give them on the production line knowledge of these organizational secrets of how to organize the production of a high-quality batch of garments very quickly. That required joint investments by Desh and Daewoo. Desh had the money to invest in a modern garments factory. They could buy they had the land, they could buy the machines, they could build the factory, but they didn't know how to organize that production to achieve competitiveness. This is the really binding constraint in setting up new sectors, new activities. Daewoo invested in that capability development. They needed to sell their fabrics. They needed an efficient garments factory in Bangladesh. And so they took about 150 of these mid-management people from Desh to Busan and taught them the organizational stuff they needed to do on site. Now, what is the financial deal here? The financial deal here was that Daewoo was promised an 8% royalty on the sales of Desh, and this would bypass Bangladesh completely and go straight from the export of the garments to the US to Daewoo. And that 8%, which is massive, you know, garments factories operate on very thin margins, it was feasible because the MFA quota rent provided that rent, which could be transferred to Daewoo to give it the incentive to transfer this knowledge to Desh. Now, you see, the complexity of this is very important. Now, of course, the MFA quota rent was an accident, but the policy implication is that the way you give the subsidy has to be done in a way that cannot be captured. So what was happening here is something really interesting. Daewoo, the reference to Suzuki is because I have another analysis of the Indian auto industry, where Suzuki did the same thing with the Indian auto industry, which I'm not going to go into because I don't have time. But both in the case of Suzuki and in Daewoo, the foreign partner that was transferring the organizational knowledge would not get paid till after this organizational knowledge was transferred. In other words, Daewoo wouldn't get its royalty unless they started exporting. This was a critically important part of the story. But there's another important part of the story. The important part of the story is that Desh could also not take any resources and not perform. In other words, Desh and Daewoo checked each other. Both of them had an interest in that project succeeding. Desh could not make money till after it had learned the organizational capabilities. Daewoo couldn't make money till after Desh had learned the organizational capabilities. And both of them checked each other, not some governance agency from either Bangladesh or South Korea. The policy that was required here was simply the agreement that 8% could be transferred to South Korea, to Daewoo, and that's the only thing that the Bangladeshi state at that time did. It allowed that transfer because that required some specific concessions in terms of capital controls and so on. And the results were spectacular. The results were that the competitiveness was achieved not in the 2 years that was planned, but in a few months. In other words, the idea that people from some country have a cultural problem with production and discipline and so on is completely wrong. As soon as the horizontal checks were in operation and the incentives were in operation, the Bangladeshi middle management achieved the requisite level of productivity in a few months. They came back to Desh. Desh's growth was spectacular. Desh grew at 100% a year. In a couple of years, 115 of the 130 managers who had gone to Busan set up their own companies. So there was a massive mushrooming of factories once you understood the organizational requirements. And very soon, Bangladesh became a big garments player. We know that story. What we don't know is the critical role of accidental policy design here, which allowed this transfer of knowledge to happen without the resources being captured. And so a number of things I want to highlight in this experience. The first was that Desh's success was because it had the basic minimum capabilities and interest to develop a competitive business. But equally importantly, the policy framework, and critically that 8% transfer to Daewoo, which bypassed the local banking system completely, that policy framework gave it the resources to incentivize Daewoo to create this knowledge transfer. And thirdly, it did it in a way that each side was checking the other side, and neither side could walk off with that 8% and not deliver. That's the secret. Now, my point is that if you look at the success of all the successful things that happened in South Asia, whether it's the Indian auto industry or the pharma industry, a similar but different complex story emerges. And we have tracked some of this in our writing in different parts of my work. So the policy conclusion, this is the final slide, that there are two kinds of escapes from Madal in countries with the political settlements like ours, which is not like the post-Japanese colonialism. I think that, so the East Asian models are extremely specific. South Korea and Taiwan had Japanese colonialism, and China had 50 years of revolution. 50 years of revolution, which broke down all horizontal links between companies, organizations. Most countries don't have the Chinese revolutionary history or the Japanese colonial history. Most countries have historically inherited very strong organizations, many of them low capability and unproductive organizations. And these organizations have many horizontal links between each other, and they collude and they can block a lot of policy implementation. So in the typical political settlement, right, there are two kinds of escapes from Madal. The long run one is indeed to strengthen the rule of law, but the rule of law will only strengthen if you buy the political settlement story. It will only strengthen as the distribution of power and capabilities becomes more broad-based. In the meantime, the challenge is to design policies that can achieve development objectives by creating incentives for existing horizontal actors to check each other. This is the fundamental, I think, contribution of our approach, my approach to effective policy design. And the examples I can give you are that successful policies actually have elements of this in the typical political settlements. So Imran referred earlier to the anti-corruption work we are doing. That's really an application. I would invite you to go to our website. We identify many examples of horizontal checks that are already working. So it's not the case if you look at Nigeria or Bangladesh or India or that everything is corrupt. The really interesting story is that there are some things which are a lot less corrupt than others, and even within certain activities, some businesses are less corrupt than others. And when you look at that in detail, you find that this is very closely associated with the horizontal checking that is going on, that in their own interest, some of these actors are checking each other. And good policy design is about enhancing those opportunities, creating those opportunities, rather than trying to completely change the distribution of power from above, which is actually quite impossible to do without, well, at least no one knows how to do it. So this is the kind of policy approach that follows from that analysis. But I would just want to end with a kind of a disclaimer that none of this is actually news to people in the real economy. People in the real economy know that this is how this economy works. So if you were asking businesses in Bangladesh or India, how do they do business? How can you do business in a society which doesn't have a contract enforcement, doesn't have good rule of law, and yet a lot of businesses are happening? And I mean, the story is, if you were trying to hire a contractor to build your wall for you in Bangladesh, how would you do that? If you were in a rule of law country, you would look for 3 or 4 contractors, you would look at their quotes, you would then take the cheapest quote, you would write a contract, and then you would make payments, and then at the end of it, the wall would be built. If you try to do that in Bangladesh, you are actually a terrible businessman, and you will lose your money, because you will sign a contract, the contractor will take the money, and the contractor will disappear. So the idea that you have a contract and you have paid the money and the wall will be built is not something that anyone on the ground in reality believes, right? So what do they actually do? So actually what they do, if you want to make, and anyone who has any kind of engagement with the real world, you don't rely on the contract. You actually find out a lot about the person you're contracting with. So, in Bangladesh, the first thing people do when they meet each other is they ask, where are you from? And the answer is usually extremely complex. People will say, I'm from this village, I went to that school in that batch and that university and that batch, and my father does this and my... Why are they saying all this? It's because people are always trying to locate the other person in terms of networks that they know. So if I will only do business with someone who I can locate in a network, and because I know that if that person tries to cheat me, I will be able to put horizontal pressure on that person from all sides to get my contract fulfilled. I will never do business with someone whose horizontal networks I do not know. Now, people think this is a cultural form. When I meet someone and people, after 2 sentences, they will ask, well, where are you from? And the answer is not your address. The answer is your where you were born, which village, which school you went to, not only which university, but which batch. People want to know who you were with in that batch.
I think we have lost
At
Mushtaq
no
again.
point do I lose too much.
Okay, all right, okay.
So I'll end here and say, what we need to do is that formal policy has to replicate what everybody knows on the street. And formal policy making needs to build in a conception, how is this policy going to be enforced? And that enforcement must rely on all kinds of horizontal checks that might exist between differing interests. We have to exploit those different interests, and that's how actually success happens. Sorry for going on for too long, I think, and for the break that happened for technical reasons. I will now hand over to BIGD for questions. Here are some links to where you can find some of my work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like everyone, the attendees, to type in their questions, if any, in the Q&A button here. We have one question or two questions. But before going there, Mushtaq, just a question I had about, the Dev story. Do governments learn from, do you think governments learn from cases that work? In particular, in Bangladesh, did we learn from this? Was this repeated in any other sector? And if not, why do you think it doesn't happen? Are these successes replicable?
I think they are replicable, but I think that we don't learn. And I think that there are multiple reasons why we don't learn. The first reason is, I think that, the people who are policymakers, and this is not just in Bangladesh, I think it's the same story in virtually every developing country. You can question whether they really have an interest in making things work. I think a lot of policymakers are interested in very sectional interests, closely tied with their own interests. And so the policy push really has to come from, I think tanks, maybe development partners, and maybe universities in developing countries. We need to actually identify the kinds of things that will work, and we need to lobby for it. If you think of ministers and so on, they have short time horizon. They come for short periods of time. They're responsive to very powerful constituencies. And so there you go into the policy adoption problem. Remember the first three circles. The policy adoption problem is where a lot of policies are adopted in our countries, which are really driven by very short-term interests. So we don't even think about implementation. A lot of policymakers are simply designing policies so that they can get subsidies to particular constituencies that are important to them. So I think we can't rely on policymakers. I think the sad thing is that when you come to the analysts, the economists, the policy analysts, that's where I think I'm more disappointed that the analysis of what works has been very weak there. And I think part of it is because a lot of our economists and social scientists are trained in Western universities, which have a strong rule of law. And in Western economies, the way you teach policy is you assume that if the policy is made, and provided you don't have any corruption and other things, it will be implemented. So Western universities teaching policymakers don't look very closely at the circle called C. That C, which I began with, comes from more kind of anthropological, sociological. Murdahl was not an economist, right? And a lot of new institutional economics is at the fringes of economics. Most of our policymakers have degrees in economics from top American universities. They don't even ask these questions. So if you don't ask these questions, you're not looking for where the answer might be. So their answer is, you have to have the right policy, you have to have a lot of competition, you have to have open economies, and you have to push for good governance, and then things will happen. And that's actually what, doesn't work. So I'm more disappointed with our policy-related academia and the kinds of discussions and debates we have there. If we could get our act together, if we could have proper analysis, we could feed that into policymakers, and some of it might be adopted. So I look at it in that way. I think that it's not a surprise that policymakers haven't really figured out these success stories, because they're complex. You need to spend a lot of time looking at alternative explanations, alternative theories, and then come to an understanding of what might be a good explanation. You can't expect a minister with a 5-year brief to figure out. But researchers in top universities to have done that. But you find that's not happening in India, in Bangladesh, in Nigeria. The top economists are talking the language of textbook economics of the US universities. That's my concern.
Questions, not a question, but just I wonder, Mushtaq bhai, obviously you sort of rely on Mirdal a lot in sort of making your. I mean,
Sorry, we are freezing again, Imran bhai. Can everyone hear Imran? Because I can't.
I
Too frozen. I don't know where the problem is. I think you froze again, Menaz. I mean, I didn't hear Imran's question. Can you hear me now? Menaz, can you hear me?
Hello, am I audible? শোনা যাচ্ছে না। Hello, everyone. Okay. Hello, everyone. We're extremely sorry for the technical difficulties that we're facing at this moment for this bad weather. We should be resuming shortly. Thank you for your patience.
Hello, can you hear me, Mushtaq bhai? Am I audible now?
Yes.
All right. Sorry, this is yeah, I think it's partly because of the really bad weather here, and so it's so hot and electricity failures. Great. So no, my question was really, how do you connect your 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 this framework of political settlement and looking at policy implementation uh, challenges with the work of Albert Hirschman or his insights. What's how I mean you talk a lot about Ghulam Mirdal. I was just wondering how does Albert Hirschman and his work fits in or doesn't with your framework?
No, that's a great question. I think that you know, I only started with Murdal for the simple reason that he raised some questions which people have been trying to answer. Albert Hirschman is a really um, on my website, and where I think I am quite close to Hirschman is this idea that he's against big bangs, right? So, like Hirschman, I also think that you can't, when you have a complex system, you can't really change this overnight. And if you try to do it, the empire will strike back and will hit you hard, right? So the issue is that what Hirschman came up with was this idea that you have to have incremental changes, and you have to select those incremental changes to have the biggest multiplier effects through linkages. And I think, in a sense, that's the starting point of good policy design. And he said that one shouldn't be too concerned about failure, because the very process of trying to implement something allows you to learn about why it failed, and then you can adapt and incrementally improve your implementation. And he called this possibilism, that you have to start with this idea that something is possible, and then you keep working at it. And failure is not really failure. Failure is information about what you have to adapt. And I think this is a really profound insight. Where I think I would add to what Hirschman said, and I think it's important to make that addition, is, as I was saying in, in answer to Mehnaz's question, makers response finally happening. And I think that I'm a bit concerned that some of my colleagues use this idea of possibilism to defend very adventurous kind of strategies that developing countries occasionally follow, saying it's okay, you don't have to follow all the recommendations of policy advice. Let them try it because they will learn from their failure and they will improve it. And the point is that doesn't happen. So what you have is a series of failure after failure, which doesn't result in any adaptive learning, which results in a lot of resources. And then the failure gets locked in because people capture all those subsidies or capture all those rents, and you create a vested interest, which makes it very difficult to change. So I would say that, the way to respond to the Hirschman's possibilism is to take a much more strategic approach to policy. That I think we need to do the homework as policy analysts. BIGD is in that business. It's at a critical space in terms of looking at the interface between governance and development. So it would be the job of organizations like BIGD, of academics like, to say, okay, these are areas where the chances of failure are lower. So the political settlement analysis is simply reducing the chance of failure because you are building in those checks and balances into the policy design, but it doesn't mean that it will be successful. It just means that we have analytically identified a lower chance of failure. You would then, the next step would be, once you have identified a policy with a lower chance of failure, you then do the kind of adaptive experimentation that Hirschman was talking about. But I would say you do it on a very small scale. You try it out in small kind of experimental interventions, and then you scale up. So what we have to persuade our governments is not to take this massively ambitious big policy decisions, because there's a very high chance that they will not learn from their failure, or even understand why it failed, or even have the analysis of why it failed. We should try and persuade governments to try small experimental things. I don't think get them to do everything experts come and say, it's not going to hurt you a lot to just try this on the side a little bit. And if it works, I think I would interpret Hirschman's contribution to linkages, possibilism, and incrementalism, right? So we need to take that from Hirschman, but adapt it to political realities, where in fact the policymaker themselves is not going to respond adaptively to anything. And the policymaker is often in collusion with different groups in society which are capturing subsidies. And so I don't think we can change that, but we can try and affect that from the margin with some interesting experiments. And all of the things, BRAC interventions, small things which didn't hurt anyone, and then they scaled it up slowly and gradually, and then had a big impact. I think that's the model, both in the social sector, but also in the business sector. We need to figure out what kinds of interventions might work, and then persuade a policymaker to just try that on the side while leaving their main activity unchanged. And then maybe, the reason why the garments experiment happened was, at that point, no one took it very seriously. I mean, people were more interested in the policy rents going to the old industries of, sugar and textile and cotton textiles and jute textiles, and people weren't concerned about the garments industry. That was like a tailor shop industry, and so they weren't interested in blocking it or even capturing those rents. But that has become, the dominant industry of Bangladesh. So that's how change happens. I think change happens in our kinds of political contexts because powerful people are not particularly interested in particular things, and then if you try and experiment with those things, and it grows. I'm really fond of Hirschman, but I don't take everything Hirschman says. Just like, Madal has lots of interesting things to say, but his fundamental conclusion I disagree with. His fundamental conclusion is you have to have a big bang. I completely disagree with that.
Thank you, Mushtaq Bhai. There are a few questions from our attendees. The last one first, because the societal interests converged in that direction. But what would be the state's interest to reform the policies in our countries when various groups in our countries have diverging interests? Can you hear me?
Yes.
So
I
particularly,
think that's
yeah, please go ahead.
no, go ahead. Finish what you were saying.
Now, the rest of the question said, particularly if we agree that state is also crucially made up, the nature of it is shaped by the very proof.
Yes. Okay. I didn't get everything you said because the line is bad, but I think I got the gist of what the question is. I think it's a great question. So, but I think that this is why history is important, right? I mean, if you look at British history or American history or European history, the state is always reflecting very partial interests, right? So this idea that, that there was a kind of convergence of interests in society and the state reflected that is an idealization which was never accurate, and it was even less accurate if you go back 100 years or 200 years. Because the state was used as by powerful group society to achieve their ends. I think what is different about the early developers, what are now the advanced countries from the late developers, is that in the early developers, a lot of the organizational evolution was organic. It happened from inside society, and there was much more intense competition between them. To give you an example, when the British were conquering the world, they set up companies like the East India Company to go and do trading. But on top of the trading, they were also actually occupying places and taking them over and beginning to run them as trading outposts. We know that history. Now, these trading companies like the East India Company were given charters by the parliament. And they came with those, official charters and legislation behind them. And then they made lots of money. And then they went back. So people like Clive and Warren Hastings, they made a lot of money in India, and then they went back. But what happened when they went back is that there were a lot of other interests in those societies, which were jealous of the money they had made and were very angry that these people had made all this money. They weren't concerned about India, but they were concerned that their competitors had made, Clive was a nobody. He came from a very lower middle class background, and he had become this kind of Nawab, he had come to. And what happened was that those other groups went to parliament and accused him of corruption and took him to task. And they started cases against things. And many of the administrators within their own checks and balances. And actually, Clive committed suicide in the end, right? Because he was under so much pressure from these kinds of pressures that this is my recollection. But he had a very unhappy end, right? He didn't end his life on a high. Whether he committed suicide or not, I'll have to go and check my history. I read this long time ago. But he certainly faced a massive amount of horizontal checks from all sorts of elements of British society. And I think this is where it's slightly different in our societies, because in our societies, and I'm not talking of Bangladesh, but in developing countries, you have a lot of overdeveloped organizations which have come from a colonial history, and people can capture some of these organizations, then it's very difficult for others to check them, right? Because the organic distribution of power has been disrupted. So, for example, in our parliamentary history or in Indian parliamentary history or in Africa, you don't find this kind of intense competition between different factions and so on, which is a hallmark of European history. Or even look at what's happening in the US today in Congress, right? The kind of, at one level, the kind of viciousness of the competition looks similar to ours, but is different in a really fundamental respect, which is that the dominant group cannot wipe out the less dominant group. They cannot use the apparatus of the state to completely suppress them. And that's slightly different. So this is a really interesting question you have asked. So it's not that they are actually aligned. I would say the reverse. Actually, in the early developers, there was divisions of interest and conflicts of interest, and therefore the census remained organic. Whereas in our case, the dominant group often, even in a very strong democracy like India, once you have state power, you can begin to silence all of the other voices in society. And that's historically not been possible. So the question, not possible in the advanced countries, right? So the really interesting question is, actually, we are in a very unhappy place, because at the other extreme are countries like China or South Korea in the 1960s, where the ruling coalition could indeed silence everyone much more successfully, but they also had the capacity to impose discipline on all the factions in society. So think of this kind of continuum, right? You have one type of society, which is like the old advanced countries, where you have a lot of fragmentation in society, but no one can impose their will on anyone else, at least within the middle classes. Emerges as liberal societies. Liberal grew up not just out of market competition, but also out of political competition, very intense political competition. And very powerful people were often, Churchill, for example, having won the Second World War, promptly lost the next election. I mean, this is unimaginable in a kind of developing country context, that you win a war and you immediately lose. So there was real political competition and real market competition. The other extreme, our party, for example, really you have no chance of standing up against the Chinese Communist Party and achieving anything. But the Chinese Communist Party also has the capacity of imposing discipline on its lower levels. So that also is a growth model. Our problem, the typical developing country, is neither here nor there. It's somewhere in the middle. So what we have is where enough of the checks, but they impose control with is the worst of all possible work with is a crony capitalist kind of development. Look at the relationship between Modi and Adani is a typical one, right? Now, these are businesses which are overpriced. They are actually not very efficient. They grow rapidly, but they grow rapidly because they are capturing a lot of subsidies. But this is not sustainable. So a similar story happened in Indonesia under the Suharto, and some of our big businesses are also similar. They're getting a lot of bank loans which they're not repaying. They're growing, true, but if you look at their productivity, maybe their productivity growth is not very high, and the figures are not very clear. So what you have is if you don't want to have competition, you must have so little competition that you must be able to plan long term, and you impose discipline on your businesses. That's the East Asian model. Or you have a lot of competition. The worst is to have a society where people are still competing, but nobody can dominate each other. But the people who are in power can silence most others, and then they can do a lot of what I call, subsidy sharing corruption. They capture a lot of policy resources. It's not the efficient profit sharing corruption that we had in South Korea. I think that's how I think about it. But I don't think it's because the Western countries, a lot of consensus in Western countries about most things. So the policy question for us is, which direction do we want to go in? Do we want to go in the direction of more authoritarianism and more sort of so-called developmental state, or should we go in the direction of more political competition, more market competition? That's the real policy question. And I think there's a very long answer to it. But my short answer is, I think moving towards the authoritarian direction is really dangerous for us. Now, why it is, because I think we will never reach the East Asian end of the pole, and small movements in that direction will result in even worse extraction and even worse policy mistakes. So that's my short answer, not so short answer.
Thank you, Mushtaq bhai. In the interest of time, we lost some time in the beginning, but just so we can finish by 5, maybe I can ask Imran to give his final thoughts and end today.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mushtaq bhai. I mean, I think every time I get an opportunity to listen, I think there are kind of new thoughts. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, I mean, this, as I said, was basically in the context of this lecture series in the context of 10 years of BIGD, where we're really asking some, we're celebrating, but we're asking some, these type of questions that Mushtaq bhai has been raising, which is, how do you look at this intersection between governance and development? And in some ways, it is a development of competitive space, the sort of state. So I think that's a fundamental governance and development question that we're asking ourselves. But I think we're also asking the kind of questions that Mushtaq bhai has sort of raised, which is, as academic institutions, researchers, as sort of epistemic community, based in the global South, are we actually being able to do our job intellectually in terms of understanding our realities and developing our frameworks based on our realities that help us understand ourselves much better, to be able to forward in. And I think we put upon ourselves in this particular regard, because I think a lot of our the epistemic community work have been driven by frameworks and methods and methodologies and theories that actually the question on the implementation side. And I think policy implementation, this is what we really heard today, and how do we analytically look at that? How do we think in terms of horizontal checks and balances? This is exactly how, how the real world works. So I think making policy analysis or policy work real has to be the most important epistemic and intellectual agenda that I think we need to really work on. And this is exactly the kind of spirit against which we are relaunching our MAGD program, the Masters in Governance and Development. We are relaunching this program, and this is exactly the kind of spirit in which we are going to be launching this program. It's going to be much more open. It's going to be much more focused on public policy. It's going to really challenge itself to try and, in some ways, southernize public policy questions. And I think, and then try to really bring together governance and development in a way that can help us move public policy for development and contributing to making sure which contributes to a better world. Those of you who joined us, and I think we're going to make this recording available, so it'll be more widely accessible. It'll be on a website and in social media and things like that. So, but most important thing is let's keep the engagement going. These are not easy questions. These are questions that I think as the responsibility is actually on not on policymakers, and I think that's a fundamental thing that Mushtaq Bhai said, which I think has been really important for me, because I think it is really our responsibility to do the kind of real world analysis through which then we can actually try and contribute towards better policy making. Great. So thank you all very much. Goodbye.